Good afternoon. It's 2:30 p.m. in the Boston area, and probably 7 p.m. in Ghana. And again, we bring you the assembly. Today, we are fortunate to have one of Ghana's leading thought leaders in the person of Mr. Bright Simmons, a social innovator, political commentator, Vice-President IMANI, founder and president and pedigree. So Bright, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Ayure?
Yes.
I don't know whether you can see me now.
Okay, now we can see you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay. So in 1975, Nigerian political scientist Peter Ake published a seminal article titled Colonialism and the Two Publics in Africa, a theoretical statement, in the Journal of Comparative Studies in Society and History. In this work, Ake introduced the concept of the two publics to explain the prevalence of corruption in African public service. He argues that colonialism created a dichotomy between the primordial public and the civic public. The primordial public is rooted in indigenous traditions and communal affiliation, commanding personal loyalty and moral obligation. In contrast, the civic public is associated with the colonial state and its institutions perceived as alien and lacking moral legitimacy. As a result, individuals often feel justified in exploiting the civic public for personal gain, leading to widespread corruption. Ake's analysis suggests that the disconnect between these two publics fosters an environment where civil servants do not view government services as their own, but rather as entities to be utilized for personal or communal benefits. And now, for a very long time, I have been convinced by this theoretical position that the legacy of colonialism has created a dual publics, and public servants in Africa do not see public service as their own. But Bright Seymour has given me a pause with his concept of catonomy, where he argues that the policy space in most African countries is dysfunctional, and it's not necessarily as a result of the individual graft per se of politicians. He makes this argument in light of the recent call by Oral to recover all loot of previous government officials, and he uses the Pwalugu Dam as a test case. So essentially, Bryce Simmons is saying that we should actually pause, right? We shouldn't have our hopes too high about the outcomes of Oral, given the dysfunctional nature of our policymaking process. Bright, do I capture your sentiments in a nutshell?
Yes, up to a very elaborate extent, and I'm very grateful that you took the time to assess my position and the effort that you've made to encapsulate it in as few words as possible. One, there is definitely a lot to learn about Africa's challenges in building a modern democratic state and the relation to the primordialism that Ake describes. But I think that over the years, in the almost 5 decades since he wrote The Two Publics, there has been, to my mind, an evolution of certain trends. I think there are many African countries which do not have the same degree of ethnic, shall I say, allegiances that he describes, that nonetheless still suffer from some of the dysfunctions that worry us. And a very good example would be Tanzania, which, as I'm sure you are aware, because of the work of the Nyerere, the Mwalimu, there is far less affiliation to ethnic allegiances compared to some other African countries. Okay. And I'll say that even in Ghana, over the years, we've seen a growing community of detribalized Ghanaians who constitute very large segments of our political public, who are not necessarily driven by primordial connections to their ethnic base. And yet still, notwithstanding this, we do have very significant degree of dysfunction in our policy space, which obviously I will elaborate in a moment.
Okay.
Second, you are right that I have a certain degree of apprehension about the gap between the very high level of expectation that the general public have in terms of the ability to hold accountable the government that just exited, and the incoming government's capacity to move beyond that to recover very large amounts of money. I want to distinguish between accountability as a virtue in and of itself, and the ability to hold to account particularly high-level government functionaries. And so that on the one hand, and on the other hand, my primary concern about waste, specifically fiscal waste in the administration of this country and the impact that it has on our economic fortunes. My belief is that corruption is primarily a symptom rather than the cause of many of our problems. And to my mind, the primary reason why corruption abounds in Ghana is due to our inability to implement monitoring and evaluation that is tied to performance. Because a lot of the kinds of corruption we see is bound up with massive failures of policy. So in essence, if you take a country like Italy, you take a country like Romania, you take a country like Bulgaria, even Russia to a very large extent, you do see very large-scale corruption incidents that threatens any notion of accountability. So if accountability was your only premise, then there are a lot of countries around the world, including, of course, Greece, Portugal, and others, where objectively, when you measure corruption, you find out that there are very significant extent of corruption. There's more money to steal anyway. These are richer countries. But my view is that the difference between the corruption there and the corruption in our parts of the world is that quite often you don't see the degree of waste that we see here as a consequence of corruption, in which case I theorize that the corruption effect is less pernicious than what we see. So essentially, in simple terms, what I'm trying to explain is that there are a lot of countries in the world where we have large-scale corruption, similar to what you see in Africa. But often the corruption can be seen as attempts by agents of the state, in this case, politicians who are agents of the state. And the principal agent problem that we understand very well in economics is pervasive to the point where obviously we didn't theorize that notion. It was theorized in the West. So that already tells you that it's very well understood that if a principal, which in this case citizens, give power to an agent, we delegate our power to an agent, the likelihood that our interest will diverge and the agent will attempt to circumvent our interest is there. It's always been there. So it's the nature of human organization that if the citizenry delegates responsibility to politicians, they will have interests that are not always aligned with us, and they will do the best they can to advance it. The difference, I think, though, in the kind of principal agent problems we see in the West and what we see here, is that in the West, because monitoring and evaluation is relatively firm, a politician must still deliver.
Okay.
My argument is that because the politicians must still deliver, the level of waste that results from corruption tends to be less. And there are three quick ways in which, to my mind, our problem has compounded. One is that we have a lot of instances where corruption is the reason why the policy is designed in the first place. And therefore, projects are designed purely because of kickbacks and purely because politicians can make money from it. That's one. So essentially, your ability to design programs and projects purely because you will benefit as a politician is heightened in environments like ours, where monitoring and evaluation is very weak. The second is that even when programs and policies are designed properly, in the course of implementation, you are able to divert a lot of funds through contract inflation, through buying things that you're not supposed to buy, and through not buying what you are supposed to buy, leading to almost a level of certainty about project failure that doesn't exist elsewhere. So essentially, disorganized projects designed because you are more concerned about the money you will make, and which therefore leads to almost a certain assurance that the project will fail. And therefore,
so
all the money spent on the project will fail.
Yeah. So
and
if I'm getting you, I just wanted to clarify something. If I'm getting you right, what you're saying is that in the West, the corruption that takes place is solely as a result of lack of virtue, whereas in our case, the corruption is sort of intertwined with the dysfunctional policy space.
Okay. What I'm saying is that in the West, there is a notion of principal agent problems that is well understood and which is of global significance.
Okay.
So everywhere you go in the world, so long as it's human beings creating an organization, if you delegate power to someone, they will abuse some of the power.
Yes.
The human phenomenon. And anytime you create an organization in which the people that are supposed to benefit from something don't have all the power to make sure that the thing is being done in their interest because they've delegated that power, the person to whom that power is delegated will abuse some of that power.
Yes.
And so every time you create any kind of system, there will be corruption. I'm arguing that the corruption, therefore, is an effect of fundamental structures of human organization. You can't do much about it. There will always be corruption. I'm also arguing that scale matters. The amount of corruption matters. And thirdly, I'm arguing that because corruption in my world is incidental, whatever it is that it is incidental to matters more than the corruption. So essentially, if the goal is to create an America that is the most powerful in the world, and it leads to a military budget of 1.1 trillion, a significant amount of that money will be wasted.
Okay.
But if in the course of the America deploying that $1.1 trillion in the service of its objective of becoming the most powerful military in the world, it also doesn't become the most powerful military in the world.
Okay.
And there is widespread failure of all the components of that strategy. Aircraft carriers are not built. If aircraft carriers are built, they sink. Stealth fighters that will make American planes hard to drop are failing all over the place. And America is losing wars all over the place. Then we don't just have corruption. We have massive waste beyond corruption.
Okay.
So take the very classic example of the 10%. And let's assume that it's even 20%. My argument is that we often spend so much time on the 20% that is lost and forget that in some instances, the 80% doesn't even get deployed. So to me, corruption is a consequence and sometimes a side effect of bigger problems in a policy environment.
Okay. So in effect, our concern should be the proper functioning and efficiency of the policy-making process. And to some extent, yes.
Our concern should be both.
Okay.
We should be concerned about corruption in and of itself because, one, like you rightly said, it's the reverse of virtue. And society should, I'm one of those people that, I'm Aristotelian to a certain point. So I believe that virtue in and of itself is important. So a society should promote virtue. So promoting politicians who don't steal is useful in its own right. But I'm arguing that focusing on the 20% that gets stolen without understanding the 80% that makes the 20% possible is misguided.
Okay.
And in that sense, therefore, virtue is important among our politicians because we should have national values. But we should also critically be concerned about those projects that don't get managed well, which lead to corruption opportunities.
Okay.
Is that clearer?
Yeah, that's clear. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So based on that, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So are you now going to tie this in with the issue of the oral and the Pwalugu Dam?
Indeed.
Yes.
So when you do oral, you should do oral because accountability is important. And there are those that have argued, therefore, that there should be evidence that this is not selective witch hunting. They are also right, because these are all important virtues. To pursue accountability, to do so in a manner that is not selective, to do so in a manner that is genuine is important. But I have two levels of analysis that is very important, if you're with me. One is that oral itself gives us a hint about the nature of policy making in Ghana. So essentially, we should treat oral itself as a policy and judge it by the same framework that I'm going to use to judge policy issues in Ghana. I hope that is fine with you.
Yes,
exactly. The second level of analysis is that there are a lot of projects in Ghana where money gets wasted. And not all of them fit the classical mold or classical notion of corruption that most citizens are aware of.
Yes.
And here I'll break that second point down a little bit more.
Okay.
For a lot of citizens in this country and elsewhere in Africa, corruption is primarily seen as embezzlement. It's seen as money that has been diverted, and that money has been diverted in a manner in which that money can be traced independently. So essentially, you had 100 million to do a project, to build a road. You simply take 20 million and you put it in a Swiss bank account. And we saw a lot of that under the Abacha regime in Nigeria. And there's a lot of tracing going on where you can easily trace that money. My argument is that in this country, historically, and it goes all the way back to Nkrumah's days, the amount of embezzlement has always been very low. And the few times we've seen even bribery, which is somebody literally giving you money in exchange for benefits, you would be able to tell that the number of times you're able to detect bribery, you can literally count them historically. We had a whole president, head of state, Ankara, who was forced to resign because he collected a few $1,000s from a business person to mount studies to prove that he was a popular politician, and if he stood as a civilian president, he would win. So in that sense, even those few thousands of dollars, he was forced to resign as head of state. And throughout our history, we've proven that generally, if you can provide evidence of bribery, we take it seriously in this country. It's very unusual that clear evidence of bribery is provided and we don't take it seriously. Yeah. We've done the same also with embezzlement. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, example is also in the 1950s with Brima. That was the first case of corruption where he had to, he was accused of taking money from a contractor after having given him a contract.
That was the Kasajan matter.
Yes, and then he had to resign from as Minister of Works and Housing, right? That was the first case since independence. Yeah.
Yes. And the J. Brima matter, which was the bribe that he was supposed to from the Kasajan group, this was a contractor in the north of Ghana primarily, is evidence that generally in Ghana we act on bribery. And I'll also make the claim that wherever evidence of embezzlement has come up, we act on it. And in some ways, this is what the former president hid behind when he kept insisting that any time evidence has been provided about corruption, he will act. And the only reason why he's not acted is that there's been no evidence of corruption in the country. Because corruption has been mischaracterized as primarily being about embezzlement. And below embezzlement, primarily about bribery. Okay. Naturally, these are hard crimes to prove. And if you over-legalize the matter or judicialize the matter, you are likely to find very few instances of clear-cut evidence to try people and put them in prison. Okay. If we accept that fact, then my argument is that we need to understand better the nature, not just of corruption, but financial waste in Ghana. Okay. And ask whether oral as a policy is concerned about recovering money that otherwise will go to waste, or is concerned about pursuing embezzlement and bribery. Because if it's concerned about preventing waste, preventing money that otherwise could go into public projects from being dissipated in whatever manner, then the design of oral as a policy will be more comprehensive than a simple program that looks at investigations in an attempt to find embezzlement and bribery.
Okay.
That is really my issue about ORA.
Yeah.
If you design a program to stop waste on the other hand, it will not look like ORA.
Okay. So, and I think we need to create a distinction here where, for instance, talking about the efficiency of our system, we separate the blatant acts of corruption by public officials from the waste that is going on due to the inefficiency of the policy making process in its entirety, right? Because I feel like we can get lost in the midst of this argument, whereby we don't create a clear distinction and say, okay, perhaps there should be laws that would address issues of systemic waste and laws that would address issues of individual acts of corruption by public officials.
So the problem is that my argument, or rather not the problem, but my argument is that those two in Ghana are so intertwined as to be impossible to properly separate.
Okay.
Secondly, we've had this causing financial loss law to the state law, which was designed primarily because it became impossible to use the classical corruption laws to tackle the issue where there's suspected corruption, but you just cannot do much about it because there's just very little evidence. So in a way, you look at the situation and go like, no, anybody operating purely out of public policy interest or anybody acting purely as an agent of the state in the dispassionate discharge of their responsibilities will not have acted in this manner.
Okay.
So we don't have evidence of bribery. We don't have evidence of embezzlement, that he's taking public money and put it in a bank account somewhere. But given the sequence of events, it looks as if there is something else going on, motivating a behavior that is absurd, irrational, and as we like to say, willful, that aggregated together or summed up together does lead to loss to the country, and which we probably suspect that there is corruption, but we can't prove. And that is, I think, the reason why the causing financial loss to the state paradigm became popular.
Okay. So do you think that politicians deliberately muddy the public policy making process as an avenue to perhaps, pilfer some money without being caught? Because, and in the process, they end up losing a lot of it too.
I think that if you ask my honest view, a lot of so-called policies in Ghana are not policies at all. Okay. And that is where the problem starts. A lot of so-called policies in Ghana are money-making schemes. And the way that they work is that they benefit cronies of politicians, close business allies of politicians, who find a way very skillfully to pass some of that money back. And there is evidence in relation to a matter that I'm not willing to make public at this point because investigations are ongoing, but in relation to a major energy institutions in this country, where we have evidence of $18.5 million created as a result of the policy making. In this case, not even policy because this is an executive agency. So in the process of decision making, this $18.5 million is generated and then it's shared over a period of time by a broker, a private citizen who doesn't even live in the country. So the money goes to this private citizen who disburses the money in bits and pieces over time.
Okay.
When you look at the nature of the evidence, it is very hard to tie it back to this public official.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll come to your issue about the lack of politics in policy making in Ghana. And that's a very perfect characterization of the whole thing. I'll come to you with that. But before that, I want us to go into the issue of the Pwalugu Dam and how that is emblematic of what you are describing right now.
So we decide for a very long time in this country that one of the things we're blessed with is rivers and other water bodies. And for that reason, we need to harness the rivers to the fullest extent possible. And one of the ways you harness river power is to build dams. So we have this whole dam building culture in Ghana, starting, of course, with the most iconic of them all, Akosombo Dam. We build pond, we continue to try and build different dams. And then over time, we decided that, large-scale dams are not always, the most efficient. So we also have a small dam strategy. One of those dams that, perhaps medium-scale dams that we've had on the books since the 1960s, is the Pwalugu Dam. And Pwalugu is a town about 30 kilometers south of Burkina Faso, close to the northeast. The challenge, though, is that, like every other large-scale infrastructure, you can have multiple policy objectives when you are designing them. So this dam was determined that it has to serve three purposes simultaneously. It has to help with flood management, so prevent flooding. It has to help with irrigation, so wean off farmers from rain-fed agriculture, because we have a problem in this country where farmers are heavily dependent on rains, and when the rains delay or they don't come, food is not grown. So why not create a dam that will store the water and distribute the water to farmers, whether or not it's raining? And then third, because a dam can also generate power, and power is something that we've always wanted some of and more of. So we decide this is the strategy for a very long time. Now, these are policy decisions, as I'm sure you agree. Yeah. It's up to the government to determine what is the end goal here. What are the primary objectives of the dam? In the course of analysis, it became very clear that balancing those three things is very hard and possibly commercially unsustainable, or at the very least, financially unviable. Okay. Because as you try and, optimize the three criteria simultaneously, as you try and balance the three simultaneously to achieve all of them, your costs keep rising. And I don't want to go into the engineering details here because of time. So inevitably, the outcome then should have been that somebody takes policy decisions at various points to say, look, let's sequence the project, let's focus on this first, and what are the engineering options available, etc. My argument is that often that kind of heavy lifting, that thinking process, etc., in Ghana is short-circuited by the fact that scrutiny is low. So the incentive to think very hard about how you will execute is also low. There's a lot of emphasis on PR. There's a lot of emphasis on putting something out, regardless of whether it does the work over time. And the reason you can do that is that monitoring evaluation is low, so the stakes are low. So if you come up with a big project and 3 years down the line it's not working, 5 years down the line it's failed, and nobody is embarrassed. Yeah. Think of all the public transport projects we've had, particularly in the area of buses, bus rapid transit programs, mass transport programs, the famous MMTS, etc., etc. All of them, I'm sure you'll agree with me, have failed. Yeah. Yet still, there's very little shame associated with the failure. Nobody discusses it. It does not become something that this attains the professional record of a particular politician. Why will you worry? We did plenty for food and jobs, and when it became clear that the price of food was not responding, the minister simply decided that he was going to turn the ministry into a market to prove his critics wrong, and had plantains delivered from the hinterlands into the ministry. It was not a matter of shame. We did not have major newspaper editorials lambasting him and making fun of him. If this had happened in the United States or Britain or whatever, this would have become part and parcel of that person's record. No, he actually went on and stood for president of Ghana. Yeah. Or at least competed to become the presidential candidate of his party. So you have a situation where policy design is not high stakes enough. And in the case of Pwalugu, by the time they went through it, if you read the record of decision making and where they arrived, it should have been clear to you that much more radical decisions have been taken. But ultimately, it became a $1 billion project. Yes. A $1 billion project with no clarity as to how it will generate returns that will cover it, except returns that are very diffuse.
But so even the initial funding for the project, right? Because you state that the government committed an initial amount of $90 million for a $900 million project. In the policy formulation stage, did they ever think about where they would get the money to pay for the project in its entirety?
No, because it was a Hail Mary strategy. So the idea was that somehow we'll find the money through the budgets over time. Somehow the Chinese will come on board at some point in the near future. Somehow, so and so and so and so. And even more critical than that, 3 years before the program was passed by Parliament, because remember that, as I've been explaining to you, this project has been on the drawing board since the 1960s, and the first major attempt to design was 1967. It was in 2013 that we started the actual execution, because AFD, which is the French development agency, decided to give us millions of dollars to do feasibility studies. Why? Because it was a French consulting company involved. So AFD was happy to give us that money because ultimately to go back to France, right? But it's a loan, so we end up paying for it. And so we spend millions of dollars on feasibility till we get to a point around 2017 when it is clear that it's very expensive. The World Bank takes a very good look at it, discusses with the AFDB and others, and tells the World Bank of the government of Ghana, this is not fundable. It's just not fundable. And so we cannot put a penny in this until it's restructured. We dilly-dally until it was decided that somehow the Pwalugu Dam thing was a manifesto promise. It was important for the Northeast. The government decided to go ahead without committed funding. Then he decided that he will use Eurobond proceeds to do it. Yeah. $75 million of Eurobond proceeds and then some government money. And as you rightly pointed out, no plan for fundraising throughout the cycle. And in fact, if there was one, nobody pursued it. So eventually we signed a deal with the Chinese because ultimately we think that because of the Chinese involvement, we'll get money from the Chinese without any commitment. The Chinese company comes on board. We sign a contract which commits us to release 15% in advance, or at the very least, we leave 50% of committed funds, and we don't do any of it. We don't follow any of the contractual terms. So we pay $12 million. The company starts doing some work. We don't do monitoring evaluation of that project. There's supposed to be an engineering team that is responsible for making sure that the money is being spent properly before they issue certificates for payments. None of that happens effectively. So eventually, after $12 million spent, not much work has been done. Meanwhile, the company continues getting interim payment certificates suggesting it's done more work until eventually we get to about $24 million of work done and $60 million of prior commitment.
But in sincerity, do you think those who were in charge of signing the contract knew that somewhere along the line, I mean, if you want to weigh their, maybe the percentage of perhaps getting the full funding to go ahead and finish up the project and not getting it at all, where do you think they lie in that spectrum? Because earlier on you mentioned that. Yes.
My sense is that the fear of failure, catastrophic failure, was not very significant.
Okay.
So when you have that massive gap in your defense as a state, where individual decision makers, senior politicians and the rest, don't fear catastrophic failure because nobody's going to track. We live in a country in which there's very little monitoring and evaluation. Policy doesn't matter very much. So because policy doesn't matter very much, the likelihood that there will be a conclusive debate in public which will attaint their record and make it hard for their political career to continue to succeed doesn't exist. I'll give you an example. There are a lot of agencies in Ghana that I examine very closely. And sometimes the disorganization, the waste, everything is so bad that in any serious society, if you wrote about it and you came out with that catalog, others will also join and do more investigations. And eventually they overwhelm any PR that the person will deploy to counter. And eventually the person will have to resign in disgrace. And eventually that person may not be able to come back to office.
Okay.
My argument is that we don't have that scenario in Ghana for some reasons that we can try and probe.
Okay.
That means, therefore, that as a political actor, your policy decisions and your policy failures have very little to do with your politics generally, but including your political career and therefore the success of your political career or failure of a political career. So policy failure and political failure are adjacent.
Okay. So this essentially sort of is a segue into your argument that in the policy-making space, there's no politics. Essentially,
Indeed.
what you're saying is that there are no vested interests, diverse vested interests that would crowd the policy-making space and allow perhaps some sort of due diligence to be done in the process.
Because one, if you have more vested interests, you have more scrutiny, you have more diverse expertise. They will write about the project, they will mount advocacy, they will go to their friends in the media to keep the issues alive, and you'll be scrutinized.
Yes.
An example would be that in a situation where it's very clear that, I'll give you a very practical example because this will illustrate it the most. When it was determined that the energy that is being produced from the dam made the dam's cost unreasonable because the dam alone was costing almost $400 million.
Yeah.
Just the dam.
Yeah.
And
just to add,
yes,
the solar project was 55 million, right?
Yes.
That would produce, I think, 50 megawatts.
Indeed.
And then the hydro project was 474 million that will produce 60 megawatts.
Very good.
That's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous, right? But then without the dam, you don't get the irrigation.
Yeah.
So you have got this intertwined mess. That's very difficult as a policy designer to look through. You have to think very hard. But my argument is that in a vested interest kind of scenario, and of course, remember that I'm not necessarily arguing that all vested interest-driven politics leads to optimal outcomes. It's a very different theory. Okay. The theory is not that, oh, if you get vested interest like America and 10,000 lobbies over every law and the rest, you get efficient outcomes. I'm just describing something without judgment first, and then explaining how it leads to certain outcomes. So I'm saying that the absence of vested interest in policy making, because politics happen separately, means that there's very little scrutiny, very little awareness, and so policy failure is not a problem. The stakes are low. If there were vested interests, think of the solar project, because the solar project was supposed to be in Krugu, right? Several miles away. There is no synergy between that project and the dam.
Okay.
The solar project was added just because they wanted to increase the output of the energy output. The 60 megawatts would look ridiculous for $1 billion project. But they were not willing to say, look, forget about the energy for now. It's not an important thing. We can't even pay for the energy that we produce in Ghana. We have 5,000 installed capacity. We are using maybe 70% of it. And there was 70% we are striving to pay for it. So adding an extra 60 megawatts at something, $474 million is ridiculous. So forget the energy project entirely and then do an irrigation dam that is less sophisticated, but can maybe support 5,000 farmers. And let's see if we're able to do 5,000 farmers.
Yeah.
That decision making, let's see how that will have worked in the vested interest complex. Okay. So imagine a country where you have fiscal hawks, people that are really, really big time on not spending too much money, public money that is not thought through.
Ideologically, yeah.
Ideologically. And some of those people, even those that are just professionals, forget about the ideologues. People that are just, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Ghana, that just look at the project and like, this is very interesting. Let's do some analysis. And they can't say this makes no sense. In that kind of environment, this will raise the temperature a little bit. Then imagine there's another group of people that are small-scale producers that feel that energy could be found cheaper than the national grid, but they don't have money to do solar, and they see an opportunity to do a 50-megawatt project. They will see that it's a $50 million project. Even if it's a $60 million project, why don't you just do that for us so we can get off-grid solar in our neighborhood at lower price than we can get from the grid? We don't want you to tie to the dam because there's no synergy with the dam. And they would have raised that matter and pushed for the solar project to be independent. Okay. Why? Because they know if you bundle the $1 billion project with no prospect of funding, it will not get done. And they want their solar off-grid solar plant because of unreliability of the main grid. Then you have people that are big on peasant farmers and who also feel that given the nature of the project, this craziness, it's much better to just do an irrigation which is where you do dikes and things like that, to start some irrigation going, to get some irrigation going. And once you have some irrigation going and there's benefits and the rest, you can re-engineer other parts of the wide water basin for irrigation. Yeah. And they will have argued that adding the dam element to it that raises the cost dramatically prevents them from getting the irrigation benefits quickly. Then others who are more concerned about the flood will question whether or not indeed this will save first from floods. Because we know that the Bagre Dam spillage, even Akosombo cannot contain it. And Akosombo is way downstream. Yeah. So you assume that by the time the water gets to Akosombo, it will have dissipated through various tributaries and overflowed that Adam River Bank. Yet still, when we spill from Bagre in Burkina Faso all the way to Akosombo, it overflows and destroys water region, as we saw recently in the Bato area, in the Tong area, and things like that. So how do you think a much smaller dam, much more upstream, is going to prevent Bagre spillage from causing flooding? In fact, every dam we've built has worsened the flooding situation for a while. Yeah. And there are, of course, Ghanaian hydrologists and the rest who have made similar claims. So if there were people that are very, very keen on the flooding engineering dynamics, they would have argued for resettlement independent of the dam. And said, look, some of these settlements are in the way of flood pathways and flood basins. And so what we need is that some communities need resettlement independent. And then you might have found that $10 million could do a lot of resettlement in countries where, in a part of the country where $10,000 per household can easily get somebody a nice house. So you have a situation where, in my view, is that the absence of vested interests mean that the different components of the projects are not well scrutinized, and that leads to a project in its totality that makes no sense. It's an absurd project in its totality.
Okay. So why do you think, I mean, our policy making space is less contentious, right?
That I have not done enough thinking to be able to give you conclusive outputs, but there are a number of areas a number of ideas that suggest themselves. Maybe first we should, I don't know whether your listeners fully grab this idea of politicization of policy. So maybe I should go right one more time.
Again,
I'm not entirely sure whether your listeners are fully in sync with this theory that our policy is not sufficiently politicized, because I often hear another argument.
Okay.
Which is that we politicize
maybe you want to explain that. How is it not? Yes.
Indeed. Yes. I often hear another argument which seems contradictory to what I'm saying, but actually on hindsight or on further reflection is not. I hear a lot about we politicize everything in this country. And so why can't we do education policy without politicizing it? And then if we just stop politicizing education policy, we'll get some optimal outcome. And I seem to be saying the opposite, that we don't politicize policy enough. So what is the real outcome there? I think that a lot of what we politicize is not policy at all. So if you think of the famous free SHS, which is the closest we've come to a policy that got politicized, the debate were not among vested policy interests, people that were organized and had great ideas about a particular approach to addressing the problem, which was dropouts. If you look at policy in its pristine state, it's an attempt to solve social problems. So it's a kind of model to solve a social problem. What was the social problem we're trying to solve with free SHS? Dropouts. We don't want dropouts between secondary school and university. In a serious country where that was truly a policy-making process, that's what we will measure. Today, that problem has not been solved at all, and nobody cares at all.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that what we really do is not policy making. So, what have been politicized is not policy that has been politicized. What has been politicized is political PR.
Okay.
So, somebody claiming that I have brought free SHS, and there's somebody trying to throw as much mud on the free SHS as possible, and somebody trying to shine as much glory on free SHS as possible. So it's a contestation over the benefits of political PR. It's got nothing to do with policy whatsoever. Because real policy would have said, okay, what are we trying to achieve? We want to stop dropouts. First thing would be to set up some kind of measuring framework. How many dropouts, how many dropouts between secondary school and university? And what is the causes? And then the debate around policy would have been, what are the alternatives that we have to try and solve dropouts?
Okay.
It would be that somebody will come up with a grand electoral policy promise, which is purely PR promise, right? Because you put a lot of branding behind it, you mobilize people around it, and you just move. And then the other party is determined to throw as much mud on it. And then when they come to power, they really have no idea what else to do, because it was never a policy debate in the first place. It was never they saying that, you know what, dropouts will not be solved by this, it will be solved by this other mechanism. And therefore, when they come to power, they then implement their alternative mechanism, because they've always been openly supportive. What you saw with free SHS was, people saying that we implemented it, but we have a different way of doing it, etc., etc. And none of it was really looking at any measuring tool to get to any real notion. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So what I mean by policy being politicized is where you have actual policy in place. There's a problem. We identify it. We have pathways to solving the problem. Everybody has his own approach, and there are different vested interests in which line that the country takes. So Galamsey, somebody says the way to solve Galamsey is a technology problem. So let's push gravity-based solutions, so we don't use too much water, we don't use chemicals. And some say, no, it's not. It's a jobs problem. So let's find alternative jobs. Blah, 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 blah. And you have like 4 different competing policies. And in that, if one policy is selected over the other, different groups will benefit differently. And therefore, they mobilize to push one debate argument over the other, one pathway over the other. That is what I call vested interest-based contestation. That is what I mean by politicization of policy.
Yes. I mean, in fact, I think even in political science circles, they tend to, there's this argument in American politics about whether policy influences politics or the other way around. And essentially, the consensus is that it's basically the same thing. Politics is policy, right?
Exactly.
But I think we're getting into why you may think that that is lacking in our political space, right? Why not competing interests? That sometimes some of these things come up and there's virtual consensus, which takes away the scrutiny and due diligence that has to be done.
I don't think there's consensus at all. I think there's apathy.
Okay.
I feel that what happens in Ghana is, for every policy that we have, there isn't enough people in civil society that are willing to invest in an alternative view at all. So think of our health policies in Ghana, the National Health Insurance Scheme. I don't know any group that have a commitment to a particular implementation approach different from what is being done, and who are willing to invest to drive it. I've never seen one. I've never seen maybe a group of hospitals that have a particular approach. Often, if there is something like that, then it's often in respect not of the policy design, but a different way to share the outcomes or to share the benefits.
Okay.
So primarily, we have a civil society that is not radicalized enough.
Okay.
And a civil society that does not believe that they need to invest in owning any policy ground. Which leads us to a chicken and egg problem, which is my difficulty at the theoretical level. So it's not clear to me which comes first. It's not clear to me whether the issue is that because policy is so low stakes, nobody sees the point of owning any of the ground in policy. Essentially, it's when you have land that has become marshy land and nobody wants it because there's no value in the policy space. So nobody wants to buy a piece of it. The real estate in policy circles is valueless. It's almost worthless. So in that sense, that would be entirely rational behavior of the civil society movement, by which I don't mean necessarily only the formal groups like IMANI, IE, and things like that. I mean, employer groups, producer groups, hometown associations, the whole gamut, basically the entire group that is not political. I think the lack of radicalization is a huge problem for mobilization, obviously. Yeah. Because if people don't have commitments to anything and not willing to invest, I have been working relatively closely with Enzima activists that are trying to stop the petroleum hub. And it's been really interesting watching that process unfold, right? Because it's only a very few of them that are willing to invest.
Okay. Yeah. So, but I mean, we had touched on accountability. Yes. And you make a point that there's no accountability in the sense that public officials do not feel any shame when there's a policy failure, right? They are not held to account in any way if they propose the policy which was lofty and they knew from the outset that this was not going to really realize the results that they intended it to.
Okay, so the way it works is that, taking Pwalugu Dam, for instance, you have a set of very complex policies around how you manage river basins for the development of rural Ghana. It's a lot of thinking that has to go into it. A lot of scholars have done work, So in the policy space, there's a whole bunch of uncoordinated work that has to be designed around river basin management. Okay, so that's the policy, the real policy realm. Yeah. What is the best way in which we utilize our river basins? That's the problem we are trying to solve.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But I was kind of circling back to a bigger problem based on our governance infrastructure, right?
Yes, I'm getting there with this illustration.
Okay. All right.
And then you have politics, which is that if I want votes in the Northeast, I'm the Vice-President of Ghana. I come from Mampusi land. And there's a dam that is supposed to be built in Mampusi land. Damn! This is great for my re-election. And I just have to go and tell people that I'm bringing the biggest investment in the North. It's $1 billion. And it came in my time. To me, that's politics.
Okay.
And then you have the political PR, which is how you bundle up the communication. And my argument is that in the process of doing that, in some parts of the world, you cannot ignore the policy, because if there's policy failure, it will redound back to you. You will not be able to forget about it and go and, like the way that the former vice president had just forgotten about Pwalugu Dam and just, he's still doing his things, right? In America or UK or China or somewhere else, it will follow you. So my argument is that when you have that kind of situation where the policy and the politics don't seem to meet, never the two shall meet, you have a situation where three things can then happen. And here I'm tying back to the governance architecture and the corruption issues and the oral and all of that. First, you have a huge amount of latitude to design projects that don't make sense, but generate a lot of money. Because nobody in Ghana is asking the question of these feasibility studies that cost us almost $70 million and have generated nothing. Because if you do a feasibility study, the goal is to minimize the risk of project failure. Is that correct?
Yeah.
In that scenario, if you spend almost $70 million on project feasibility studies for the last decade, and we still don't have any dam at all, not even a fraction of a dam,
yeah,
that means that we've wasted about $70 million.
Yeah.
If you ask which of the consultants have this money going to, nobody has to account to you because nobody in Ghana cares.
Mm-hmm.
You understand my point?
Yeah.
So I would tell you, for instance, that one of the consulting companies that are involved has been run for a very long time in Ghana by a politically exposed person who has been Minister of State. It was one of the persons being tried in the Saglini matter who had just been declared free by the current Attorney General.
Yeah.
Right? How did he get involved in the Saglini matter? Nobody knows. Nobody cares.
Mm-hmm.
How did he get involved in Pwalugu? Was he responsible for managing the project? Because he was one of the consulting engineers. Were they the people that were responsible for signing the payment certificates? Yeah. Nobody cares. And in that regard, how much money has been disbursed to people for no work done?
Okay. Okay.
My argument is that if you are oral
and
you don't approach things from the point of view of policy fixing, but your goal is to go and collect money, you will not be able to collect any money, just as we've not been able to collect any money for Saglini.
Okay.
Because what has happened? The Attorney General has just gone there and filed noli prosequis, right?
Yes.
Everybody who was involved in Saglini is now free, right?
Free, yeah.
So what the money that we claim we have wasted in Saglini, $100 and something million and no benefit to anybody. Who is going to reclaim it? Obviously, nobody's going to reclaim it. So how do you do oral when you can't reclaim the money? Because the way in which the thing is done, when you prosecute somebody, feels unfair. Because of the fact that this is integrated and embedded in our governance structure itself.
Yeah.
You see what I'm going with this? So in the end, you don't get any money back. Yes. What the point I'm trying to make, you don't get any money back. If you don't get any money back, then oral doesn't succeed.
Yeah. Okay. That's smart thinking. But I'm taking this back to the overall governance infrastructure, right? So for instance, in ancient Athens, they weren't elected officials, but they were always opinion leaders that would go into the assemblies and promote a certain policy. And if the assembly adopted the policy and it failed, that person was sent on exile for at least 10 years. So that was the system of accountability that was built into their system, whereby at the very founding of their democracy, the first principle was accountability. Now, we take it to the United States. At their founding, liberty was a founding principle, and liberty here essentially was accountability. So when they were putting the pieces together, for instance, in the executive, the legislature, every single one of it, they will always cycle back to the concept of liberty, essentially having the ordinary people hold the leaders in check, right? But in our situation, and I had a conversation with Justice Atoga last weekend about this, it seems like we have no founding principle in terms of our governance arrangements. And so it is completely devoid of any form of accountability, and perhaps it might be the reason why there are no competing interests in our policy space, whereby, politicians can just be mediocre about, putting a policy together, knowing very well that it's not going to succeed.
So I'll do you one better.
Yeah.
The Asante State. In the Asante State, they realized that spiritual leaders are very powerful. And in some ways, I think, even though there were a lot of them very spiritual people, and some part of their brain, they begin to realize that holding spiritual people accountable is very difficult because they can always claim that God told them, right? So they came to a position where they said, okay, if you are not comfort and you prophesied on a high stakes matter like war, this is what you have to do to win and things like that, and it fails, we just kill you.
Okay.
And that is why in Asante political architecture, we don't have the notion of priest kings. The Gas went a very different route with very different consequences on their political unity, which is why there's so much unity in Ghana lands, because of the notion of priest kings and the notion of the inability to have ultimate political authority. Of course, it has its own advantages, in the Ayawasu kingdom and things like that. They found ways around it, and we don't have the room to debate, the advantages of either system. But I just wanted to explain to you that in our own history, we've come across problems like this where we decide that, okay, if somebody has spiritual power and can claim that, the spirits, the ancestors told him something, we can't verify the rest. The only way we do it is to up the stakes, up the ante on accountability. So we don't even have to look to ancient Athens and the Archon system and all of these things. We can also look to our own African history.
Yes.
The principle of accountability, to my mind, comes back to this idea where the accountability sits only in politics. If the accountability sits only in politics, they will organize around politics. So today, the way they interpret their defeats has no policy bearing, right? They organize it all around patronage. So if you look at the diagnosis of why the MPP lost power in the last elections, almost 90%, at least the actual MPP people, 9% of it's about people that were not happy because they were not getting some of the spoils of office, appointees that were not very responsive and therefore they were not responding to their phone calls. You can listen to them and that's all they talk about. But there's no discussion whatsoever about policy failures. Why? Because where is the evidence and the data and the public opinion around policy failures? So we go back to this issue where we don't have, within our current situation, citizens that are radicalized enough that coming from a policy point of view, they can hit up the polity. Let me explain again. Yeah. If you go to South Africa right now, land expropriation is both policy and politics. The government has to figure out a way because there's a lot of raw emotions tied to land and they need to redistribute land. So the government has had to come up with this expropriation policy with a lot of safeguards, but also a lot of room for risk. But it was high stakes and it had to be done. And going forward, there will be people that will be monitoring to see whether or not Black people are getting access to land redistribution of opportunities through the expropriation policy. I'm saying that in our part of the world, in Ghana in particular, we don't have enough of these policies that are enough of these policies that have been sufficiently politicized. And I go back to the argument that I made that if you take Galamsey, which is a classic example, there were proposals around implementation, proposals around specific proposals that were made that are of a policy nature, ban mining in forest areas. Some of them were already existing policies that have been made into law. And remember that in my framework, it's politics, policy, law. And the law is the distilled essence of policy once we are certain of the outcome of the policy. Okay. Where you have a problem where the policy is parallel to the politics, law implementation is also lax. So a lot of the things that they are discussing, for instance, not mining close to the riverbed, were already in law, just lacked implemented in a lax fashion. Today, the new president has responded to the issue around the forest mining matter. Why? Because there was organized civil society around that matter. It is a very distinct, clear matter. And there's been a response. The next stage of them being able to monitor implementation comes back to whether or not, indeed, the matter was politicized. And what do I mean by that? When the civil society people genuinely vested interests. Because if they were genuinely vested interests, we should see them in the forest monitoring or investing in some mechanism to monitor. So my point around politicization and radicalization of civil society, which will make it difficult for politicians to ignore them, takes into account the fact that if the vested interests are not truly vested, but are purely also in it for another form of PR, so they are playing the same game as the politicians, they just also want their time in the limelight, as we've seen with some civil society activists who pretended as if they had vested interest in matters, but all they were doing really was just positioning themselves in the limelight. Then you have the problem that we have. So my point is, are we really politicizing its policy? Is it policy that we are politicizing? Or we are just participating in political theater? They are not the same thing. And that is really what it is. Accountability, to me, is difficult if you don't link it to policy. Because the policy is the content around the problem solving.
Anyway, so, I mean, Bright, it's surprising that we've done an hour already. So I just wanted you to conclude on the subject of oral. But before then, I wanted to ask you this.
I mean, I have time. So if you have time, I'm fine.
Okay. All right. Okay. So yeah, we can go on for a few more minutes. But the issue of sole sourcing, how does it play into this lack of vested interests. Because sometimes, as we know in the United States, all these policy entrepreneurs and for instance, lobbyists, right? They get into the policy space based on their competing interests to get certain projects.
That's what we don't understand. So when I was making the argument, somebody, reached out to me and said to me that, I'm being very naive about policy making in the West. And in the West, because he had misinterpreted me to be saying that policy making in the West is more participatory than Ghana. But that's not the exact claim I'm making. I'm making the claim that if you go to the US defense establishment, not a single penny is spent without vested interests. And those vested interests are politicized. And because the vested interests are politicized, there's a lot of mass elements involved. I'll give you an example. If I'm a senator and I look at the UN defense budget, 90% of my concern is which of them is going to lead to jobs and purchases for my district.
Yeah.
Now, you don't think that is political? You don't think that's because I have people in my district that are heavily mobilized around it, people that sell soybeans or whatever it is that feel that the US military should be buying more? All of these matters are the situation that leads to investment by civil society, and that leads to radicalization of civil society in the process of contesting policy. You get my point?
Yes.
So my argument is that if you have galamsey, and there aren't people that today will benefit from a certain policy to solve the problem, and those people are not mobilized, and they are not galvanizing, they are not doing any of the things that will radicalize more people and therefore create political counterweight to the policymakers. And therefore force the policymakers to look behind their shoulders when they're making decisions, then ultimately you're going to have increasingly, as we've seen, a situation where the policies don't respond to anything other than, in some instances, because policies still must be made, somebody then designs a policy purely to make money, which I call state enchantment. Because what happens eventually in that scenario is that they take things that we value a lot in Ghana, they dress them up, they assign a lot of money to that thing, and then it ends up that they don't achieve any objective. Practical example, we've done SIM card registration in this country at least 5 times. We just had the new Minister of Communications. He insists that the private police have all failed. Notwithstanding the millions of dollars spent.
We spent on it.
Notwithstanding the fact that citizens spent a lot of their time doing it. How is he able to say that with a straight face? Because clearly, we live in a very different context to what we think we do live in, right? The notion that we have that, we live in a country where there is policies, there are and then politics, and then there's law, and somehow there's an interconnectivity among the three. I'm arguing that there isn't.
Okay.
So he doesn't really care much about the policy and its implications as much as he cares for whatever interest he needs to serve.
Yeah, the political
benefits. Yeah. Now we have a situation where in my state enchantment investigations, I've chanced upon a lot of interesting policies, like an attempt to give everybody a credit score in Ghana, where the only reason they were pushing that was that there was a new credit scoring company whose founders are very close to the vice president at the time.
Okay.
And that's the only reason. That is why in the transition notes, if you ask the different ministries that are involved, there's not a single well-reasoned documentation behind this so-called credit scoring. Not a single.
Yeah. So what it means is that if we had a laissez-faire system where, for instance, nobody knew who is going to get the contract for this credit scoring scheme, then perhaps politicians wouldn't be pushing certain agendas that may not inure to the overall benefit of the country, because they are not going to be so sure that their person is the one going to get the contract.
True. I mean, I think that, and this is the question you asked in the very beginning that I was struggling to answer, which is that in a country where you have, people that are in the ICT industry, many of them are struggling, etc. A scenario where only a few ICT companies, because of their closeness to political actors, get large multi-million-dollar contracts, deploy things that in the end don't make much of a difference. Look at how much money ECG claims they've spent on digital transformation, and their losses keep going up.
Yeah.
In any serious country, a lot of ICT companies that have lost out on those contracts will mobilize together, their own interest, their own supporters together, and attempt to make an influence in policy.
Yeah.
So they will attempt to create policies that prevent ECG from being able to do the things that he's doing. So the question you ask, I think, is the answer question, which is how come over and over again, elites in this country don't seem capable of mobilizing, even to serve their own interest.
Yeah.
That, I think, is the longer journey of my own intellectual discovery process. Because, this is a very difficult question to answer. But I think it's very, very strange that in any sector you look, in agriculture, in ICT, whatever, you have all of these failed policies, continually failing policies. We can't track them. The few of us who do track them, nobody really bothers. Very few bothers. And there's just incapacity to reflect on failed policies and the waste that is being generated. So we come to oral, and you look at the 800 distinct initiatives that they believe are tainted by corruption, and when they think they can get the money back. I've just taken Pwalugu Dam and broken it down very extensively to prove that the likelihood that they will get a penny back is almost zero. And I think that if we take some of the other ones, we will come to the conclusion that in many of those instances, they will not be able to recover money as well, which leads us to a very interesting issue. If oral was a policy, what problem are we trying to solve? Let's say that we're trying to solve two problems. Money that is already lost, we're recovering as much of it as possible. In which case, the first question to ask is, that was the KPI. How much is it that we are hoping to recover? Who is going to track whether we are recovering it? And what is the monitoring mechanism? The second is that if oral also aims to prevent these kinds of losses from going forward, then what is the mechanism that they are going to embed in our ongoing policy making to prevent similar waste from being generated? And how do we measure it? Who is monitoring?
So how about the people who argue that we must start from somewhere, right? That irrespective of the fact that oral doesn't have the potential to recover all the huge sums of money that have gone down the drain, but that it's a good initiative because we have to begin from somewhere.
Yes, but then the point is that begin from somewhere to go where, and what are you monitoring? Right? How do you know you began from somewhere? And how do you know that, because in the end, oral will have to spend money. Because it will have to do investigations. It will have to prosecute people. So if you take oral as a policy, ask some very basic questions. Where are the policy documents? What are the institutional arrangements in terms of monitoring? What are the institutional arrangements in terms of evaluation? What are the stakes? And then go back to my theory around politicizing policy. And ask yourself, who are the vested interests who will ensure that oral is doing any of these things? If you come to the conclusion that now all of these things are missing, but you still have some hope, then in a way you are part of the problem, because that is what we've had with all the policies. So why don't you become radicalized and insist that, okay, I supported the NDC because of oral. I want you to do oral rights. So I'm demanding all of these mechanics. The report will be submitted next week. When the report is submitted next week, we want to see a defined policy. We want to see a clear sense of implementation criteria. We want to see some parameters for measuring success and failure. Who will be responsible for failure, etc. Because my view is that somehow our inability to raise the stakes is our bane. We're just stuck in this mode where, okay, at least this little one is good. This little one, then eventually 3 years down, we find out that actually that little one was not even good. Nothing was done. And we've seen so many of these things. I hear a lot of people say that about at least free SHS, at least we've had something, some people are not paying fees. And then you show them that in some instances, people are paying more in the free SHS because their parents are spending to rectify the problem, and they are still fine. So my view is that it's not about whether or not somebody has tried something. It's whether or not we have the capacity to do better.
So I guess your point is that oral is probably going to end up plugging the low-hanging fruits and present them as basically the harvest, and then we'll cycle back to the same reason that we got into the mess in the first place. Essentially, politicians wanting something for political capital.
My view is that, like a lot of inverted commerce policies that we present, oral is in and of itself good. Nobody can have an objection to accountability. My second view is that in that process, are we clear what we are supposed to get out of oral? If we are not, we should demand it.
Okay.
There's no reason, there's nothing that restrains us as citizens from demanding it. Third, are we willing to invest to follow up some of our time, some of our advocacy? We all have an advocacy tool now because of social media, right? The least you can do is visit the pages of the few people in this country who follow these matters and retweet what they are saying and comment on what they are saying and build conversation. Okay. You get my point?
Yeah.
Then the fourth point is that if oral does not lead the path, does not create a path to lead to less waste in our public sector, why in God's green earth will we create a policy that has potential, and then because we are so satisfied with its mere creation, argue with those who insist that we should do better with it?
Okay.
Why would we do that as a citizen? It doesn't cost you anything to demand better. So ask yourself whether there's a psychological block somewhere deep in your subconscious that prevents you from asking for better. Because otherwise, why not ask for better when it costs you nothing, except to ask for it? So when people get exasperated by those of us who insist constantly that why can we have a gold refinery in this country? That gold refinery is supposed to be paid for by the Indian government, but the government of the day seems to have assigned 80% to an investor that nobody can find. We've sent people to India to look for the investor. We can't find an investor. And this is the only state-backed gold refinery in this country. And they are exasperated. Why are you exasperated? Yeah. It's not your money that somebody is threatening. We are just insisting that who is this 80% shareholder that you can't mention.
Yeah.
If you have a problem with it, if you are somehow exasperated by it, if you are tired, if you get frustrated, oh, this guy is talking too much, this guy doesn't think he knows than everybody, then there's a deep psychological disease. Because it's not rational.
Yeah.
The person is not collecting your money to do the advocacy. He's on Twitter saying his thing. Why are you? So my view is that if you have a lot of people in this country who are pathetic about it, who are exasperated by it, who are frustrated by it, then they have a psychological disease. And they have to sit down and become aware of the psychological disease and realize there's something wrong with them and begin to fix themselves. Because if you fix yourself and you open yourself up, you cannot help but be radicalized. It's inevitable that you want to push to ask these questions, to demand these answers, because active citizenship will come naturally to you if you're a normal person living in a society where the cost of living is going up because government is borrowing so much, and government is borrowing so much because government is spending so much, and government is spending so much because government is wasting so much. How can you be apathetic when it doesn't cost you much to join a big? Because what are they going to do? Arrest 1 million people in Ghana because they are complaining, asking for more their money back? It's not possible.
But do many of the citizens understand that relationship, that perhaps some of these mismanagements are the reason why perhaps prices are high and all? But I guess they can see the direct relationship between, for instance, a party that they support winning power and they knowing somebody in a position of authority who can help them, versus actually looking at it in sort of a more complex way, whereby managing the country very well would benefit them. Basically, their conditions of living would improve significantly.
Yes, and that's why I'm often not surprised by the behavior of political activists in Ghana, because you rightly pointed out in the two publics, when you were reading out the two publics, that people create these patronage networks with direct benefits. So if somebody's a political activist in Ghana, I don't expect that person to be rational or reasonable in my way of looking at policy, because they operate purely in the realm of politics. As I've explained to you, in Ghana, politics is the beginning and the end of all, right? So if I'm making policy noise and that policy noise is very insignificant to their world, in their world, they don't become minister because somehow they've been championing a policy for the last 15 years, and then the president comes to the point and realize, oh, this person has a deep connection to sanitation. He's written about it. He formed this NGO about it. So he becomes Minister of Communication, sanitation. But rather, he becomes Minister of Sanitation because somebody does that and does some permutation. And then, are you guy? Are you this, and it falls in, and then you are positioned there. Why can any political activist in this country be interested in policy or interested in the enhancement and optimization of policy? It would be ridiculous, you and I, if we expected that. So my concern is about the middle classes that are not political activists.
Okay.
You see what I mean? Because the middle class that are not political activists will not benefit from the largesse. A few business people would, and therefore I'm also very happy to see them being quiet, except when their interests are being damaged, when they are not beneficiaries, but they are still quiet. My concern is about the vast middle class where we have in this country. Some of them are on social media, and the only thing they do is read. They don't share their opinion. They don't retweet. They don't, tag political actors and ask them to explain. They don't raise their voice in any manner. It's a very strange phenomenon. And then they say, oh, if you do that, you might be targeted. I'm saying it doesn't make any sense for even in North Korea, you know, where they have millions of people, they struggle to keep defectors inside North Korea. Then you live in a country like Ghana, where compared to most other countries in Africa, you have the greatest freedoms. And if in a country like Ghana, you still insist that you are scared of some politician, you are you have a serious psychological disease in my view. Because it's not rational. You are seeing things, you are seeing delusions. If there was 100,000 people tweeting things on Twitter, the politicians cannot suppress them. We don't have the apparatus. Check the number of people that are in our national security. China has millions of people that are just censoring social media. Millions. They just sit there reading people's accounts and then removing posts and things like that. In Ghana, we don't even have overt social media censors. Why are you scared that tens of thousands of you could potentially be suppressed? It doesn't make sense.
Okay. So what you're saying is we have to energize the civil society, right? And that I mean, ordinary individuals interested in civic issues.
Absolutely. We need to do that first. That's why I do a public education mandate first before I do policy advocacy. I do most of what I do, 80% of what I do is public education, because my hope is that some people eventually that have an interest, same people that are watching News Far, that are watching News Hour, what do you call TV3 Key Points, and all of the big issues on CTFM. Some of these people are interested in policy. They are interested in public affairs. I'm trying to convince them that politics in Ghana is not the same as policy. And what I write about is the nitty-gritties of policy. And if you're going to spend 1 hour, 3 hours watching a political show on TV, and you cannot spend 30 minutes reading an article that takes you into great detail to let you understand it, then you have a psychological disease. And because you're not aware of it, and psychological disease cannot be solved by medicine, right? For the most part. A lot of them is you have to be aware first, because they're not psychiatric disease, right? So a lot of them is awareness and changing of your perceptions and your thought process and things like that. To realize that policy is a different domain. And in Ghana, most of our problems have come about because we ignore policy. And because we ignore policy, we are not able to track performance. And because we're not able to track performance, a lot of things are designed that ends up wasting large amount of resources. And if we don't stop that, we'll have another domestic debt restructuring program that is worse than the one before. Most of you will not be able to build a career in Ghana. You have to run away out of the country to do that. And so we have to understand that it's really us versus a small group of people who are rationally preserving their interests. There's no point preaching to politicians to change their behavior, preaching to their political activists to change their behavior. The problem we have is that only the politicians and the political activists talk. I want to energize and radicalize a lot of citizens and get them involved. Not on the politics, but in the policy, asking questions about things that are done in their name to improve their life. That don't make sense. I've spent a lot of time trying to explain to people that Ghana Card, for instance, they think is a great thing and the rest of it. But Ghana Card is actually leaking money and not delivering the benefits that they think it's delivering. Things like that.
All right. So, but I mean, I would like us to conclude soon, but I have one question. For instance, when I was reading your article, I noticed that, the initial contract was between the Ministry of Agric and the Chinese company. But the Ministry of Finance actually also wanted to enter the subsequent contracts.
So what happened was that the Ministry of Finance was not willing to move unless it had more control over the project.
So is there any personal interest of the individuals involved here, or why would that be the case? Why won't just one ministry?
With these things, right? You have to make inferences, because nobody will leave an email lying down and that says clearly that, I did it because I wanted to make sure my contractors will benefit, or I want to make sure the consultants know I'm the one paying them, or whatever. So my job of bringing all the information to you so that you can piece it together and make your inferences, which is why I try and provide as much information as possible. Provide the links to the references, give you screenshots of the documents. So you yourself, in reading them and reflecting, going back and reading them and reflecting again, get a sense of how politics and policy in Ghana conflicts.
Right. So when President Mahama was about to name his ministers, you had actually put out some news that there was somebody who was being considered for an appointment, and that perhaps there was warning to the incoming government that some adverse information might come out about the person. Are you willing to disclose who it is?
No, because how I got the information was privileged. This was an international bank that has sent some information to the presidency, suggesting that they are still investigating and they may eventually take this person on. And they are very strong, very credible information that this person will be made a minister. And once the person is made a minister, that might embarrass the government because they may not back down. My understanding was that that person was obviously made a minister, and that somehow the government, has advised the person to engage this bank and try and resolve the matter.
So the person is currently a minister?
True.
Okay. All right. Bright, thanks a lot for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, look, we have to do this again. There's so many stuff that we need to talk about that we haven't even touched.
Absolutely.
And hopefully when I call on you, you would show up and honor my audience.
It's always a duty and a privilege.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, to our viewers, we appreciate you. Thanks for joining us this evening. And until same time next week, have a blessed weekend. All right. Bye. You let it yum, 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 yum. Nayela pere, matinayela pese. You let it yum, 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 yum. Nayela pere, muna kapela, chora kakisa, oyari yela pere, balungana baire, tupa ani, imping tuna, masanta tapage, bayu tujele, masankele yura, babantu yara, oyari yela pere, bongana baire, tupa ani, asikul jatuna.